Welcome to the Undivide Project podcast, the Changemakers Edition. I'm your host, Monica Sanders, and I am so excited to be joined by a wonderful colleague, sometimes mentor, sometimes mentee, changemaker, wonderful professional in this space, Mr. Jarrett Lewis from Dentsu.com or Dentsu Good and a few other titles at Dentsu if I have it right, as well as a first-year law student at Fordham University. And we're going to be talking about why this conversation around climate change needs to be intergenerational and it needs to cut across racial lines. Thank you so much for joining me, Jared.
Thank you, Monica. It is such a pleasure to be here with you, and I am so excited for the conversation today.
As am I. So let's start with, obviously, we're both from two different generations. We're both cuspers across a couple of different generations. And, the first thing on my mind was we have a group of people who are in elected positions, who are the heads of corporations in positions of power, who are stakeholders and decision makers that have some standard of care, some requirement to the generations behind us who are going to inherit the consequences of our decisions. And we know the timeline, like what the decisions we make right now, the decisions that I make or have the ability to influence are going to impact your life more so than it will be mine. What is it that older generations should be thinking about? What is the duty that we owe to the people who are going to come behind us in these next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And my brain goes a million different directions. For me, we're in this moment where I think politically people are unwilling to listen to each other. But I think that is actually much more interpersonal and much more of a longstanding issue than, we'd like to let on. And what I mean by that is, issues of the environment are connected to every other issue you can imagine. It's connected to economic issues, both from the risk perspective, but also from the perspective of investments that have reduced the ability for communities to respond to environmental shifts. And what I think in this moment and what this moment requires is a broadening of our understanding of what those relationships are. And in order to lean into that, in order to have this evolution of thought, you have to be willing to learn. And that goes both for, I think, generations that are more mature as well as up and coming generations. And I don't see that happening in a bidirectional way. There's often on one end, if you're typically younger, and I don't think this is a new sort of stereotype. It's don't trust anyone over 30. I'm now over 30. And I'm like, no, you can trust me. Trust me. I've been working at it for a while.
I've passed the marker. Yeah.
I've passed the marker and I'm trustworthy. And so, there's this tendency to say, they don't understand. They don't get it. They aren't as savvy. They aren't as connected. They aren't as understanding. I think younger looking older and older looking younger, it's the same thing, perhaps with a bit of inversion, as they haven't experienced enough. They weren't there when this thing happened. They don't get it. They don't understand. And, this moment requires an evolution of thought, I think, from both lenses, both perspectives. And I think what's owed is to cultivate that environment. And you can do that through shifts in institutional culture. You can do that through moments like this, where you're leaning into the dialogue. It really is about how do we perceive the moment and what are we willing to perceive in the moment.
I love that. And there's a couple of things in there that I want to unpack. Most definitely that when we talk about climate change, climate action, environmental issues, that the systems being impacted are interconnected, and that didn't happen sua sponte. They always have been. We just haven't taken a step back and looked at this holistically and saying that our economic struggles, our political instability, our racial instability, and our interactions with the environment are not sitting in their own specific silos. And so we have the tendency, collectively, the we across generations, to want to solve one thing at a time. To say like, well, we don't have time to do this because there's the war in Ukraine or Niger, the instability in Haiti. So when you peel back the layers, there's a scarcity issue there that brings us back to our changing world. And what's horrible that is happening in Hawaii right now, and we're listening to this in the middle of August going into September for our audience to get some context purposes, is that we're sitting here watching this weather event that's exacerbated by climate. But underneath it, we've got tinges of colonialism having to do with the mainland's relationship with Hawaii that's impacting the response. There's some socio-racial, ethnic underpinnings to it. And it will have long-term economic and political consequences to this event that we're watching. And so understanding that when we're talking about climate action, we're talking about interconnected systems is an important thing to point out and to really bear some thought about how we actually go about solving these problems. Right? And then the other piece of it, the across-generational conversation, because I don't think it's new. I agree with you. And what you have is an older group, and I encounter this as an ex-millennial cusper in the workplace. The division, particularly between millennials and boomers, is palpable. And one is not listening to the other. And some of it is the naming and saying this one versus that one. And then on the other end, the struggle to understand the difference in living and perceiving and the way that we want to manage ourselves at work and in other spaces. That I applaud some of the changes that millennial Z cuspers have brought into different spaces that actually prioritize humanity and interactions with the earth and more expansive thinking. But it's about getting one set of individuals' way of thinking flowing up and being received and understood, while also honoring the lived experiences of the older generations that have come before us. Because, sometimes when I'm speaking across and I'm talking to students, I say, well, our elders taught us how to protest. We might not agree with who they've turned into since they had their turn being the young people protesting, but we wouldn't know anything about civil action if it weren't for the baby boomers who experienced some of the lowest points of in the United States, our country's history. I think all of those things were just lovely, and I wanted to unpack those two things a little bit more and just get into it a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I think more broadly, when we think about sort of social issues, social inequality, whether that be related to race or gender or caste. In the United States, we live in a race-based caste system. You find that they, to your point, they are undeniably tied. But I think our willingness to believe in our sort of growing understanding of those relationships requires or has come because of the emergent situation we're in. And so for example, what you're referencing about Hawaii, and, I went to visit Hawaii because, when I was younger, it was a family vacation, and I was shook because without saying something that's going to get me in trouble, but all the people selling real estate all look like one type of person, and those were not the local people. And,
no, they were not.
going on tours and hearing people say, oh, I actually have 2 master's degrees, but I'm working as a tour guide because you can't survive on the island. With being from the community that many of these people were from and just being educated alone, the island does not support, right? The governance of the island does not support sort of the indigenous culture, the indigenous community, the indigenous presence in a way that you would expect an economy built on an island of indigenous folks to do.
Yes.
And then simultaneously, you have these competing cultural dynamics, and maybe not even competing because one is losing, right? So you have sort of this element of colonialism, this leftover element, and this very present element, and then you have sort of this indigenous community living within that context. The island of Hawaii has more cars than it has people. They don't sell them because there's not enough people to sell them to, and both from a sheer number perspective and also from who can afford them. And it's really two different systems living concurrently. And the people who can and will be able to respond to even this current crisis are the people who are privileged in the privileged system. And so, I think that it's moments like this that make us see what has been clear, I think, for a very long time. The term environmental racism isn't new. I come from the south side of Chicago. It's at the site of old industrial. It's part of the southeast side of Chicago is old industrial land. You can't build on it. And so you start to see, we polluted the land. We don't have the technology or have not invested in the technology to clean it up. Usually when that happens, you have to leave it vacant for a number of years. But then people are relegated there and are segregated there. And one, they are experiencing the real pollution of those issues. Yes. But two, you then have the inability to build community around them and to build infrastructure around them that make the quality of life a quality. And so
or sometimes the infrastructure is designed to disrupt that.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And in addition to that, I tend to be the person who tries to see to believe that there is a positive intention, which it certainly is not the case in many instances, in most instances, in fact.
Yeah.
But then there is a piece of it that is maybe I shouldn't say unintentional, but that is inherently biased, and that it's the decisions, leaders make on the micro level that has exponential effects on these communities. And it's really a values thing. It really is a values thing. It's what are we valuing? Who are we prioritizing? Why are we prioritizing them? I'll give you a story. I was talking to a colleague in the sustainability space, and I work in sort of the corporate social responsibility, corporate ESG, corporate sustainability space. And this person, in giving me some advice about the work that I'm doing, which is very much about understanding real issues and creating solutions to those issues, challenged me on sort of the direction I was taking, because it was the direction least traveled. It's harder to do, which, by the way, this is all hard to do because we haven't been doing it. And their feedback was essentially that if you care about money, you're going to do the simple route. You're going to do the route that's going to get a deliverable out, regardless of if that deliverable, if that product, if that solution solves anything material. And to me, that was the perfect analogy. So this person is older. I reached out to them to give me advice just in the CSR ESG community. And that feedback is the complete opposite of what needs to be happening in this moment. And I think that is the perfect sort of example of the differences in values, as in his approach versus my approach. But he's been around a little longer, maybe a little bit more tired, was around when, some of these conversations were just beginning, and just has a different philosophy on how this work should be done.
Right. Or, I don't know the person. I'm going to use this story that you've given me as sort of a straw man for similar persons or similar potential attitudes. Is that, we're in a capitalist system. And for some people, the way forward is to gain capital, because part of this, issue with environmental justice, there's a poverty piece of it, where people are boxed into environmentally and economically poor situations. And sometimes the way out is through gaining as much capital as possible. And at the individual level, the way people perceive their ability to make changes is if I somehow get to the top of the heap, and I am able to get enough access to capital, then I can turn around and make change. As opposed to, perhaps I'm not going all the way out of the situation. I'm going to be a change maker and an agent and a disruptor while I'm in the situation. It'll mean some short-term sacrifice in the spirit of a longer-term success, right?
Absolutely.
Because part of being in a caste system is that whether you realize it or not, sometimes when you're on the receiving end of the system, you're the one whose behavior and opportunities are being prescribed by the system, is that you accept it. And the people on the other end who are involved in the prescription sometimes don't even realize what they are perpetuating. When they say things like, another great example is in what's happening with native lands on the mainland U.S. is, on the one hand, we've got this well-intentioned, even though I have an asterisk and a question mark by it, of returning certain parts to native control. But then when we were looking for more sources of lithium, and for those of y'all who in my audience don't understand the importance of lithium, if you have any kind of quote unquote smart device, it needs lithium. And it is not a permaculture product. We have a fixed amount of lithium on this planet, and the mining of it is disproportionately in the global south and in communities of color. Much of the U.S. resources of this product have laid on native lands. Mm-hmm. The United States government wanted to open up a space for lithium mining, but it would have meant incredible harm to a native community. The conversation was not one of negotiating amongst peers about how do we solve this. Mm-hmm. I actually watched op-eds putting pressure on the native peoples to not be so resistant and unfair to keep the rest of us from getting access to a luxury that they don't have access to, cannot afford to purchase, even after not even entering into the conversation about how do we pay a fair price for the opportunity to do this on your land. Just like, no, you should allow the U.S. government to make this public land and extract from you as we have been doing for the last couple of centuries. And how dare you push back? Don't you see the harm you're doing to the rest of the people who took your land and prescribed you into this space? This is not your place in this system. Right? And these two things are happening along each other, this sort of psychological disconnect. And we know what happened, unfortunately, because this is not a new story, is the U.S. government, one, they're going to find a way to take that lithium irrespective of the harm that's being done to Native people, while we sit and have a Native woman as the head of the Department of Interior. And so we have all these incongruencies that are happening that are breaking along racial and ethnic lines. But you make an interesting point, is like, we're not going to get to that place of mutual collaboration, of negotiation, of respect, if we don't divorce ourselves from needing to hang on to this caste system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, so I was a student, not literally, of Saul Alinsky, but I was a TA in a course called Community Organizing 101 in college, and I was a community organizer in Chicago. I differentiated myself because I consider myself a visionary organizer as opposed to resistance. But what's important is Saul Alinsky put pen to paper, the theory of what resistance is. And what he noted, the first time he wrote this book was in the 40s. He wrote an addendum in the 70s. And what he said is any institution built to resist the system in 3 years will be a part of the system if it survives. And that starts to make sense, because to survive, you still got to keep the lights on. The people who make an organization work have to continue living. And the system in which we're in requires certain things for that to occur. It requires resources, literal as capital, but and social resources. And so they just become a part of the institution. And there are a million examples I can give to that. But the central sort of feature of the book, the central message is it's all about revolution and constant revolution. And I actually believe that the moment we're in is from revolution to revelation, meaning reveal. And that, again, to the point that you're making about that sort of cognitive dissonance, that psychological association, is we have to, and we are, I believe we are, because humans have a way of approaching the brink and then pulling themselves back, at least in the last 100 years. And to pull ourselves back from this brink, because it is so many actors. This isn't two countries pointing a nuclear weapon at each other, and there's one person in each country who makes a decision. Two people, we're talking about billions, have to collectively decide as to how close to the brink we're going to go. And I do believe that when it comes down to it, again, I'm the optimist, the constant optimist. Some people say, no, we're just going to go right over the edge. That people will start making those decisions. And they're going to start making them because to our earlier conversation, they're going to see how they all intersect. You're going to see that when the weather is above 100 and I think 15 degrees, that your bodily function starts shutting down. You're going to see that you're not going to be able to travel from point A to point B in the way that you were 10 or 15 years ago. You're going to see that systems that are reliant on or consumable goods and services that are reliant on systems that are at high risk because of extreme weather and global warming, because of labor issues attached to that, when they start to become unaffordable, and it was always going to eventually become unaffordable. Inflation was always going to inflate to the point of no return. But when it becomes unaffordable to the average person, that well, geez, maybe I cannot continue to do business the way that I have. I think it's going to be those things when you're having wildfires that are not just happening out in the West, but they're happening in the Midwest, or smoke coming down from another country altogether. Eventually, I think that people will start to experience a taste of dystopia and say, oh no. And not only that, the taste of dystopia is going to force people to have a value shift, because when the systems no longer serve the average person and the average community, they're going to have to be a community, unless they want to go, into immediate interpersonal conflict, which is a possible direction too. But I think the average person is good. I think the average person actually will say, well, at the very least, I need to eat, and to protect my ability to eat, I'm going to try and protect yours as best I can. I think that we will come to that moment. Unfortunately, it's not because of a voluntary commitment, but because of an involuntary nudge, should I say.
Yes, a nudge from the planet. Because while I agree with you, I am a relentless optimist. I also believe that nature always wins. So one way or the other, part of that's attached to the failure to see that we are living on a living planet, and we are part of the ecosystem. And while we may be at the top of certain food chains, we're not the dominant force in the ecosystem. So there's a realization about that is very prescient. And I do agree that even the average person is fundamentally good and wants to collaborate, particularly with the people nearest them. And I even think the harshest capitalists, as you so eloquently laid out, once we come to the realization that, particularly around heat, is attached to public health, it's attached to your labor market, your ability to travel and transport goods, your ability to actually produce and gain capital, then we'll start to make the appropriate corrections. And there is, joy in activism. Because some of the perspective, and this is how I say an optimist is someone who's, transitioning quickly, and as we all should, into an older space, is I remember when we had acid rain in the United States. And when we had a hole in the ozone layer, and you could barely go outside without having to wear, the highest SPF you could find, and being careful if you had asthma and having sunglasses on. And every once in a while, through the noise, a Science Journal article will cut through and talk about, oh, by the way, that hole in the ozone layer is healed. And you know why it is healed? Because we all did the thing that we needed to do to heal it. And we're having issues with our water again, but it's about the water infrastructure. It's not acid rain where you are concerned about rainwater hitting you. It's because we fixed it. And we did it because at some point when it looked like we were at the brink, we listened to the scientists. Science communication got really clear. And it said, you need to stop with the hairspray. You need to put covers over the nozzle that goes from the gas tank to your car, right? You need to put some filters on these refineries. We need to really be enforcing the Clean Air Act and cutting back on how many CFCs go into the air. You know what happened? People did it. The companies who were producing the hairspray just made pumps or removed the chemicals that were the issue from the hairspray. And those styles went out of style anyway, so we just stopped doing that to ourselves. Like, there's some pictures of me with some giant bangs from back in the day. But you know what, dear science, thank you. It wasn't cute anyway. I needed to stop. But that's what we needed to do to get rid of the hole in the ozone layer and the acid rain. And it took us having our day-to-day lives disrupted by the thing. And then suddenly we all woke up one morning. Next thing you knew, people were tossing those hairspray cans in the garbage. The nozzles that we now take for granted when we're pumping gas that you're probably used to, that wasn't always the case. People just used to stand there with those, all of that stuff just out in the air, inhaling it. And so, because I had the perspective of, even though I was small, I remember this. And I know some people older than me probably remember the policy around it or were even involved in the policy around it. I just remember it from a young kid's perspective and having to stop doing some things even at that age. So I think we'll get there.
Yeah.
But we need to understand that we're at the brink and we need to get the communication really clear.
Mm-hmm.
So that people at the household level know what they're supposed to do. Like, tell me what's today's equivalent of throwing out my suspect hairspray.
Yeah. Well, and it's also about understanding the evolving nature of leadership, and that I actually think that one of the effects of unchecked capitalistic thinking, I guess is the way you would put it, although, we've spoken before and we've noted that capitalism isn't the only system that creates challenges for people. So it's really, again, a values conversation. And certainly we have much to draw upon because we're living in a capitalism, but I think it's really about how do we respect and orient ourselves towards each other, and that begs a question about any range of systems that could or are not in existence. And but the evolving nature of leadership in this moment, and one of the reasons why I do the work, why I do this work from a corporate lens, although I've gotten pushback again from those generationally saying, "Oh, you're not trying to do anything." And I'm like, "Well, you wait back up. Let's look at the data." Organizations and companies have become are reaching a point where they, you might even call some of them sovereign, and that's an important distinction, because the ability of government traditionally to put a check on an organization, I think, we have examples of industrialization we sort of saw in the 1920s to the 1940s, these companies becoming really large, becoming really powerful, and the government coming in and saying, well, we're going to break you up. You're making too much money. You're too powerful. The ability to do that today is shifting for a range of dynamics. And part of it is the way technology itself is evolving, and the way that companies are not necessarily just capitalistically in terms of the pure amount of cash that they have or pure amount of revenue that they generate, but also technologically and socially powerful. And so organizations are becoming sovereign. And so it becomes important that we really reimagine what our expectation is of the corporation and of the organization. And this isn't a comment, by the way, on whether I believe corporations should be sovereign. It is a comment from a policy perspective and a observation that they are becoming sovereign. And from that perspective, you can begin to shift some of these outcomes by really small but seismic interventions by those leaders, by those corporate leaders. And I have found that many of them want to do it. They just don't necessarily have the infrastructure or the understanding, the perspective, the data on what to do. And so I just think it becomes important that in this generation, or as you just sort of spoke to sort of the interventions that happen at a time to bring us back from the brink. But we really reimagine who the actors are and acknowledge that there is in the world, and not everybody, but there is a sizable amount of goodwill and good intentions, but there is not a sizable amount of knowledge and understanding. And to your point about scientific communication, the data that helps organizations that really do control portions of our society make the decision that they want, that is the right decision, and in a way that serves humanity and the planet.
Yeah, and it is, and we're coming up on time, but another guest made an interesting historical point that I wasn't aware of until I had this conversation, is that we're entering into late stage capitalism. Is that the first 100 years of capitalism was about mercantilism and colonialization. Right? The second age has been about industrialization, the timeline that you point to when we had the wonderful Standard Oil cases and the Rockefeller cases where we developed our antitrust law, which was meant to protect consumer and larger society from overgrowth of corporations as entities. And now we're coming out of that into something else. And it's this space of being able to reimagine that will take us into the something else. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a binary choice between capitalism and something else. It may be a new era of capitalism or an entirely new system that we had not contemplated yet. It's possible if we're willing to reimagine and re-engage. But I will say to you, Jared, I think we could even have a part 2.
I'm just getting started.
We should have a part 2 of this conversation, actually talk about the responsibility of corporate actors, because we will have a number of guests who are either leading large corporations, large cap corporations that we all know, or who are starting new kinds of corporations to address some of the challenges that we're talking about. So there's a lot ahead to be discussed in this podcast series. And I'm thankful to you for spending part of your day with me and for taking some time to engage in this dialogue, which I hope our audience will continue.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And Jared, really quick, absolutely. And really quickly, where can our audience find you if they want to learn more about your work?
Sure. I am available on LinkedIn, the only social media that I really engage in. And if you just type in Jared, Jared, Lewis, Lewis, it is a unique enough name where I should be in the top 5 results or so.
Okay, you can find Jared Lewis on LinkedIn. You can listen to this podcast on Spotify, Deezer, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite audio episodes. And you can follow the Undivide Project on all channels at Undivide Project. Thank you so much for listening, and we will hear and see and learn more next episode.